Welcome back, friends. So in this video, we're going to talk about scoping chain. All right, so what does that even mean? Well, scoping basically answers the question, where can we access a certain variable or function? In JavaScript, each function creates a scope, which is a space or an environment in which the variables that it defines are accessible. So in many other programming languages, a scope is also created by if blocks, for blocks, or while blocks, but not in JavaScript. So here in JavaScript, the only way that we have to create a new scope is to write a new function. And this is something very, very important to keep in mind when you're writing in JavaScript. Also, in JavaScript, we have lexical scoping. And lexical just means where something is written in the code. So it's about the position of something within our code. So lexical scoping basically means that a function that is lexically within and out of function, which means that it's written inside of another function, then it gets access to a scope of the outer function. All right? It's also called a parent function. And with that, it also gets access to the variables and the functions that the parent function defines. All right, now we got that out of the way. Okay, so basically wherever we have some code, let's say it's inside of a function called say hello, that code is running in a specific context. So it might have some variables and it might have some properties, and scope is referring to whichever variables and properties are visible in that function. Now, that could be a different side of another function, or if we had functions nested inside of each other, which is certainly something you can do. We might have different scopes and different variables that are visible. So this will make sense, I think, with a few examples. So I want to start with something simple here. So I'll declare a function here. I say function say name. And inside of this function, we'll declare a variable name equal to Sheldon. And it's going to console log that name. So let's call say name and save this and go to the console. And here we see Sheldon. So inside of this function, in this scope, we would call it name is equal to Sheldon. All right, so let's return to our code. Now, if I try to access name out of the function, and you know the boundaries of this function are these curly braces, actually we can say the scope of this function is inside these curly braces. And when I try to access this variable, which we defined in the scope outside of the function, what do you expect to happen? So to try that, I'll say console.log name. Now you see the moment we are outside of the function. So save this, go to the console. And here when I refresh, I get an error. It tells me name is not defined. All right, so let's go back to the code. So what this shows us is that we have two different scopes inside of this function. One context, one scope. Name is defined in here, but outside of that, and what we would call the global scope, we're not inside any function. So when I type name, I get an error because it doesn't know what name is. It's not visible in this scope. So now I'm going to define another variable outside of the function. I'll say var name equal to Leonard. And down here, I'll say console.log name. And here again, I'm going to call say name as my function. So first, I want to comment out all these statements and clear the console. Now I'll open this code again and save it and go to the console again. So here we see Leonard and Sheldon. Cool. So let's go back to the code. So we reach Leonard from the global scope, and we reach Sheldon from this function. All right, so this is really important. When we create a function, it has its own scope, its own set of variables, right? That doesn't mean, though, that instead of a function, we can't access variables that are defined outside of the function. So just to show you an example, I'm going to comment out all these. And this time, let's use a variable count. Variable count is equal to 18. So in the global scope, I can access count, right? So I say console.log count. Now, if I declare a function, let's call this write count. I say function write count. And inside of this function, I say console.log count. All right, so let's try it out. I call write count with parentheses and save this and go to console. And we see two 18s in our console. So see what that shows? Here is when we define something outside of a function, we still have to access it inside of that function. So when we go back to the code again, here you got to think of this as child scope. So this is more specific. It's about drilling down into a deeper level, and child scopes have access to things to find in the parent scope. So if that analogy helps you, go ahead, run with it. But basically, to sum it up, if we define a variable outside of a function, we can use it inside the function. But the opposite is not true. So we can't reach to the child scope from a parent scope. We can say that child can take a variable from the parent, but a parent can't take a variable from a child. All right, that's clear, I hope. But just remember, in JavaScript, we can create a scope just by using functions. And this point as well is very important. You don't create a scope with an if block or a for block. All right? So let's comment out all of this and save it and go to the console. So we'll clear here and go back to our code again. So let's do another example. We can write a function inside of another function. All right? For instance, I'll say function say hi, and inside of it, I declare a variable called myword, and it's going to be equal to hi there. So then down in here, I'll say console.log myword. And now inside this function, I'm going to create another function. So I say function say bye. And here inside this function, I'll write console.log myword again. And now the same time when I call this first function say hi, I want this function to call this inside function. So I'll say bye and call it with parentheses. Okay? So now down here, I call say hi. And you see what we did here? We created a scope with this say hi function. And inside of it, we created another scope with this say bye function. Now we can reach to this myword variable from inside the function, right? Because this say bye function is a child scope. And we said that child scope can reach to the parent scope, which is say hi in our situation this time. So we can reach to the variables of the outside function from the inside function. Okay, so now let's save all this and go to the console. And here when I refresh, we see two hi there's in the console. One from our say hi function and the other from our say bye function. Okay. So now let's go back to our code. Now right in here, if I make something like this inside the say bye function, which is our child scope, I say declare another variable called this time your word, and it is equal to just bye. Now, if I try to access this variable from say hi, which is our outside or parent scope, I change this, my word, to be your word inside the say hi function. I'll save this, go to the console. So now when I refresh the page, boom, I see an error. It says your word is not defined. All right, so that's as expected, of course. So let's go back to the code and you'll see why I said what I said. So here we couldn't reach to this your word variable, right? Because we defined it in a child scope and then we tried to access it from a parent scope. Not possible. So let's comment out these lines and make another example. So here in the global scope, I'll declare another variable. This time I'll say var sentence equal to hello world. Then down in here, I create a function. I say function, say sentence. And inside the say sentence, I declare another variable. And again, I'm going to call this variable as a sentence again. This time, it's equal to bye-bye. All right, so the important point is I define this variable again. I used the var keyword. And now, inside the function console.log sentence, and here I call say sentence, and I save this, go to console, and here, refresh the page, we see bye-bye. All right, so go back to the code. This time, our function reaches its own scope, although we have two sentence variables. And here in the global scope, let's console log sentence and save this and go to the console. And this time, our bye-bye from our function and hello world from our global scope are here. So as you can see, we get the bye-bye and we get the hello world here. That's because these two variables are not the same variables. We use the var keyword here again, and that created a different variable. So now if I delete this var keyword, what we do here is we've defined a variable in the global scope, and inside the function, we manipulated that variable. And why is that? Why can we do that? Because, as you may know, we can reach this variable inside this function. All right, don't lose track of that. So I'll save all this, go to the console. So here, when I refresh the page, this time I see bye-bye and bye-bye. Go back to the code. And this time we defined a variable here and manipulated that variable down here. We didn't create a different variable. Okay. All right, so let's make another example. So here I'll say function right number, and inside of it, I declare a variable called x. And set it to be equal to 30. And here, console log x. Then down here, I create another function called do something. And inside of it, I'll just say console.log x. And now I comment out these other lines. And actually, I want to change these x variables to be my x. And now I'll call right number here and call do something here. And save this and go to the console. So when I refresh the page, we see 30 here and an error. It says my x is not defined. And go to the code again. So why is that? Because my x is not defined in this function or a parent of this function. A function can reach only its own variables or its parent's variables. And in this situation, right number is not a parent of do something. So these two functions are totally different functions. So we won't be able to reach my x inside the do something function. All right? I know it makes sense on some level. Review it if you need to, because function scope in JavaScript is something that you cannot take for granted. But I know you get it. So it took a little while, but we've got a lot of examples in there for you. And why don't we take a quick pause here and we'll continue in the next section. See you on the other side.